Good afternoon. These days mark the 27th anniversary of events that shaped the history not only of Azerbaijan, but the entire Soviet Union, making collapse of communist rule only a matter of time. Azerbaijanis call it Gara Yanvar, which means Black January. It's a day when Soviet troops stormed Baku and cracked down on peaceful demonstrators, killing at least 160 civilians, many of whom were women and children. It was an attempt to save communist rule and put down Azerbaijan's independence movement, but this attempt was doomed to fail. To talk about the significance of these events, we're joined by longtime specialist on Soviet ethnic and religious matters and former political analyst for U.S. State Department, Mr. Paul Goble.
Well, as it happens, I was at a conference in Jamaica of American and Western specialists on the Soviet Union. And so I was getting phone calls from my office. I was then director of research at Radio Liberty in Munich, but I was in Jamaica to take part in a conference.
So what did it tell you? I mean, what exactly were you able to find out about?
Well, it was the information that came through made it very clear that what the Soviet government had done by invading a portion of what it claimed as its own territory, by using unrestrained military force against its own population, made it clear to me that the end of the USSR was rapidly approaching. And it is significant, and this is something that I did not learn exactly at the time, but only a few weeks later, that the Autonomous Republic of Nakhchivan declared its independence from the USSR. That was, therefore, 2 months before Lithuania voted to restore its independence de facto. Many people around the world know about the Lithuanian action and the way it contributed to the end of the Soviet Union. Very few people, unfortunately, know about Nakhchivan.
Or Azerbaijan. Why do you think that is the case? And especially given the fact that both Tbilisi and Vilnius, they took place after the crackdown in Baku, and death toll, the number of victims in Azerbaijan was much higher. And yet the international community was able to learn about the two other events before it learned about the Baku events. What do you think was the reason for that?
Well, that people knew about what was going on in Baku, knew something in the West about what was going on in Baku. They knew it roughly at the same time. What was the shortcoming in the West was that almost all the coverage of what was happening in Azerbaijan was by journalists working from Moscow, rather than from journalists being on the scene. And that had a very negative impact because it meant that many of the stories that came out initially were through a Russian lens rather than through an Azerbaijani one. By the time that the Lithuanians voted in March of 1990 to move to recover their independence, there were a large number of Western journalists and ethnic activists in Lithuania who were therefore able to report. And it was also the case, let us be clear, that the government in Lithuania, having come to power as a result of those elections, had a very large interest in calling the attention of the world's population and world's governments to what had happened, whereas the regime that was still in place in Azerbaijan had a very different agenda. We should remember that the most important event in many ways, or most important response to the events in Baku, the criminal actions of the Soviet army, was the decision of Haidar Aliyev to go to the offices of the permanent representation of Azerbaijan in Moscow and declare that he was on the side of the people rather than on the side of Soviet tanks. That event, because it took place in Moscow, got some attention and forced people to think. But there was not the concerted attention to Azerbaijan that there should have been. It is a failure on the part of us in the West. Those of us who tried to make sure there was attention to it were always fighting those who thought, well, everything that Gorbachev was the only thing that mattered in the USSR. What happened in Baku showed that whatever Gorbachev said or did, the days of the Soviet Union were numbered.
And you mentioned Vilnius, you mentioned Tbilisi. I wonder, but also at the same time, the other Eastern European countries as well. The communism was fallen across the Eastern European countries, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and yet in Berlin, when Berlin Wall fell, in a matter of hours, people were able to cross the border, and with no, at least, major bloodshed. But in Azerbaijan, we witness huge crackdown. Even now, it's very hard to look at those terrible images when, tanks ran over people, over 100,
Right.
really 70 people killed,
At
and
least.
dozens of
Probably
at least,
more than that.
and dozens of people missing, gone unknown. And what do you think was Kremlin's Gorbachev was trying to teach the other Soviet republics by
Well,
what it
I
did
think
in Baku?
two responses. On the one hand, it was precisely because popular revolutions were sweeping through Eastern Europe that many in the West, in the United States and elsewhere, were afraid that they would extend to the Soviet Union itself. And there was a widespread belief, absolutely not true, but a widespread belief, and one promoted by the Soviets, that if the USSR disintegrated, there would be loose nuclear weapons, and we would have what people at that time called a Yugoslavia with nukes. So there was a natural reluctance to see the spread of the freedom revolutions of Eastern Europe into what was then the Soviet Union. What Moscow was trying to do, the second part of your question, what Moscow was trying to do was to send a clear signal that anyone who tried to move toward independence, and Azerbaijan was clearly moving in that direction, would suffer the worst possible consequences, and that Moscow was not afraid to use massive force, confident that it would not be challenged by any international power. I think the West made a profound mistake in not seeing what happened in Baku as the crime against humanity that it was. I think we should have held up this as an example of what was wrong with Gorbachev, what was wrong with the Soviet Union, and we should have more actively supported the Azerbaijani people. That didn't happen, not because some of us weren't making that argument at the time, but it didn't happen because the policy in the West at that point was we want stability above everything else, again, out of the fear that there would be the spread of nuclear weapons if the Soviet Union collapsed.
Interestingly, Gorbachev was awarded the prestigious, influential Nobel Peace Prize in 1990, same year as he ordered tragic crackdown in the streets of Baku. Now, you mentioned, do realize that he had indeed immense contribution to the dissolution of Soviet Union, or indeed to de-escalating the Cold War. But how could this happen? I mean, same year, how could the crackdown or deaths innocent civilians in Azerbaijan not be taken into account while deciding who gets to be the person of the year?
I'm among those who don't think Mikhail Gorbachev should ever have been given the Nobel Peace Prize. I think what he did not only in Baku, but in Tbilisi, in Almaty, in Yakutsk, in Vilnius, in Riga, mean that this is not a man who should have been viewed as worthy of the Nobel Peace Prize. Having said that, let us remember two things. On the one hand, Gorbachev was saying all the right things as far as a lot of people in the West were concerned, and the Soviet Union was loosening up. There was more press freedom than there had been, and that, of course, made possible a lot of the national movements. But I don't think that he should have been given the prize. The decision to give the Nobel Peace Prize is not a decision that is made in Washington or Berlin or London. It is a decision made by Scandinavian scholars and politicians who do it for all kinds of reasons. And I think that Mr. Gorbachev should be remembered as the butcher of Baku and not as the father of glasnost.
Do you think that 26 years after the Black January, no one has officially apologized to the bloody bloodshed in the streets of Baku? Do you think that the Kremlin owes this apology to Baku, to the people of Azerbaijan?
I think that Moscow should recognize that this was a crime, that it was wrong, that the use of armed force against your own population is wrong. Unfortunately, the current occupants of the Kremlin have used military force against their own population within the current borders of the Russian Federation, in Chechnya and elsewhere. And so it's hardly likely that they will ever do the right thing with respect to Azerbaijan. But this was a crime. It should be recognized as such, and the people who were directly involved should be held accountable.
Now, 26 years after this event, how is Russia's approach towards its minor neighbors changed? Is it less pretentious? Is it respectful of its minor brothers or minor neighbors of the former Soviet countries?
Tragically, the current ruler in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, thinks that Moscow should have the entire former Soviet space, and perhaps much more, as part of a Russian sphere of influence where Moscow is the predominant power. And he appears to believe, with some justice, that there are people in the West who are prepared to grant that to eliminate problems in bilateral relations. That's a short-sighted view by Western leaders who think that, but Mr. Putin will become increasingly aggressive toward his neighbors. He's invaded two of them since 2008, and I believe that he is quite prepared to use other means, military force, corruption, blackmail, the whole range, in order to try to, economic pressure, to try to force them back into a Moscow-dominated arrangement. Not necessarily into a single country, but into a Moscow-dominated area, which is not in the interest of the peoples involved. I wish I did not think that. I wish I believed that there was a recognition, a universal recognition in the West of just how dangerous this is. The Soviet Union fell apart because it was an empire based on force. If this Russian Federation grows into yet another empire based on force alone, it will disintegrate, and the next disintegration will be nastier and more violent than 1991 was.
Mr. Paul Goble, thank you
Yes.
for being with us. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being with
Oh,
us.
thank you.